Hi, welcome everyone. Folks are streaming in, so I'll give us a couple moments to get started. But thank you for joining us this evening to hear about Margaret Engel and Joseph Gerson's trips to Korea and Japan. Um, Excited to hear more about that tonight with all of you. So we'll give it another moment for folks to join, and we'll get started shortly. I think we had over 200 people register. We've got almost 70 in attendance so far, and people are joining every second. So thanks again for joining us, and we'll be getting started in just a moment. Thank you all for joining tonight.
Mm.
All right. We are up to 80 attendees so far. I think people are continuing to join us over time, but I'll just, I guess, kick us off nice and slow before I hand it over to Margaret and Joseph. Thanks everyone again for joining. My name's Emily Rubino. I use she, her pronouns. I'm Executive Director of Peace Action New York State and a board member of the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security. So I'm very excited to be moderating tonight's webinar discussion between Margaret Engel and Joseph Gerson, who I both have the honor and pleasure of working with on a daily basis. Both Margaret and Joseph had the opportunity this summer to travel to Asia. Joseph was able to go to Korea and then Japan. Margaret was able to attend the World Conference Against A&H Bombs in Japan um, in August. And I think this year, especially with it being the 70th anniversary of the Korean War Armistice Agreement and the 78th anniversary of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and given our current political climate, it was a really powerful and timely uh, time to be making these trips. So I'm going to pass it over to Margaret in a second. For those of you who haven't had the pleasure of meeting Margaret, she's wonderful. She's the Student and Campaigns Coordinator here at Peace Action New York State. She's based in New York City, and she helps oversee the work of our Panis University chapters and our student network, which we just started the fall semester of with at least 16 chapters. We just had our first call last night. And she's participated in, as I said, the World Conference Against A&H Bombs this summer, and in the past in MIT's Reducing the Threat of Nuclear War Conference, and also the International Peace Bureau's Peace Wave. She also went to Japan, some might not know this, like a month after returning from a Fulbright trip in Bosnia. So we like to keep her global. And we're really glad to have her back in New York with us to share and report back from her time in Japan. So with that being said, welcome, Margaret, and feel free to take it away and tell us a little bit about your time in Japan.
Thank you so much, Emily, for that introduction. Wow. Yeah, and thank you to CPDCS, thank you to Panis, thanks to MAPPA. I'm very, very excited to be talking about this tonight. Yeah, as Emily said, I had just come back from a Fulbright and was not even working again with Peace Action for 2 weeks before Emily shipped me off to Japan in her stead as she was caring for her newborn nephew. who is apparently joining us tonight also. So, I'm excited for him to be hearing this too. But yeah, as someone who is young in this peace movement, and I've only been doing this for a few years, it was really such an honor, and it was so humbling to be able to come to Japan. It was my first time on that side of the planet, and I had such an amazing experience. So I'm excited to be sharing that, and I brought visuals. So I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully, fingers crossed, this works. All right. So, as I said, this was my first time in Japan, first time on the side of the planet, and it was just so inspiring as someone in the peace movement. And I want to take back everything that I learned and put it into my work, especially my work with the student chapters in Peace Action. And so this is me in Hiroshima with some of, actually, no, this was Nagasaki, and it was with some of the members of the Kobe chapter of Gensikyo. And so I want to say that in this experience in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I had 4 major takeaways. So I'm going to spend some time talking about each of those. The first major takeaway, which you might have expected as I am the student and campaigns coordinator, is that I was able to connect with so many student activists. And it was amazing to see that the student presence in the Japanese peace movement is alive and well, and it works in different ways than what I expected, and also what I see in the American peace movement. I saw that in both Hiroshima and Nagasaki, in the rallies and the commemorations and the outside like exterior panels and initiatives, students were playing such an integral part in it. They were speaking, they were presenting, but they were also handing out flyers. They were bringing us to our seats. They were doing just so much. And it was really great to see them being a main focus. We talked a lot throughout this time about like the intergenerational gap within the peace movement. And a lot of people had questions for me to talk about that in my experience as a young advocate. But also it was just great to see students having such great like leadership positions in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The people who were speaking were very knowledgeable about the issues, and they came from middle schools, from high schools, and even universities. Something that I wasn't expecting was that a lot of the students came from like totally non-political backgrounds too. And that was I think, a difference between the American peace movement, is that a lot of the students that I work with in our student organizing program are political science majors or international relations majors, and they want to have political careers or be within that field at least. And it wasn't really the case here in Japan. I mean, maybe I'm biased because this is just one person's experience, but I talked to so many different students who were studying medicine or in other STEM fields or education, who were really just in this movement because it was something that they believed in and something they were passionate about. And that was really inspiring. Something that struck me was that a lot of the students said that the way the education system worked in Japan was that there were kind of competing narratives about the atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, where nationally in Japan, there was a much cleaner narrative of, it was horrible, it was an atrocity, it did bring an end to the war, and it didn't go much beyond that. It didn't show, the consequences that Hibakusha faced. And so in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, students were saying that in those schools surrounding the area, there was much more education about it, and it was much more present in their upbringing. And so I thought that was really interesting. And it made me think about my own education on the atomic bombs and how in my social studies classes growing up, there was very much this narrative that it was this necessary evil to end the war, and that America had to do it. President Truman had to make this sacrifice to save millions of deaths. And so then when you go to Japan and you really get this other narrative on the other side, I mean, it's really eye-opening, and I think it needs to be talked about more. So that was something I wanted to bring up. But yeah, I loved speaking with those students, and hopefully I can do some more, international actions with them, and maybe even bring these students together with the peace action students and have them meet and just connect and exchange ideas. And here's some more photos of the students that I saw. And it was really cool the way that they were bringing art and design and music into all of the movements they were talking about. That was really inspiring as well as an artist. The next takeaway that I have is just talking about hibakusha representation and how I had known, of course, about hibakusha. And for anyone who's unfamiliar, a hibakusha is a survivor of the atomic bombing. And I had heard firsthand hibakusha stories before in New York, but to be in these cities on the anniversary of the bomb was so humbling, and it was just so heartbreaking too, but inspiring at the same time. And it was a privilege to be able to listen to these people tell the story of where exactly they were and what happened after that in the decades of their lives following. And I just was so struck by how brave these people were to be dedicating their entire lives to their story and to this movement. I learned that the average age this year of the hibakusha is 85. And so it really shows that it is more important than ever to be talking about these stories and making sure that they live on, because these people have dedicated their entire lives towards a nuclear-free world. Something that I feel ashamed that I wasn't thinking about before was the presence of Korean hibakusha. And I'm sure Joseph is gonna, have something to say about that too. But I didn't take that into account, that during the time of Imperial Japan, there were plenty of Koreans who were forced laborers throughout Japan. And so there were many laborers stationed in Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the time of the bombing, and they faced the same physical, emotional trauma that the Japanese hibakusha did. Unfortunately, the Korean government didn't recognize the Korean hibakusha, the Japanese government didn't, and certainly the American government didn't recognize them. So there was no resources provided to them, no medical care. And so they faced discrimination, oppression in their countries, as well as the Japanese hibakusha. And so that was, really heartbreaking to learn about, but also I couldn't believe in myself that I hadn't thought about that before. And I was able to sit down with two members of Spark, whose logo I show here, and they are an anti-war group based in Korea who work on anti-war initiatives on the DMZ, but as well as providing advocacy for these Korean hibakusha. The next thing I want to talk about is the new Japan Women's Association, or Shinfujin, who just welcomed me and Ulla Klutzer from the United Women Against NATO with open arms and were incredible to us. And so we were able to speak at one of their events. There were supposed to be two, one in Hiroshima and one in Nagasaki, but unfortunately, because of the typhoon, the second event was canceled. But in this event, it was just amazing to sit down with women of all different ages, where there were students, there were women who had dedicated their entire lives to the peace movement. And we were able to exchange ideas and just talk about what it means to be a woman in this movement. And it just reaffirms my feelings that the future of the peace movement is made and built by women, and that we are constantly at the forefront of these social movements. And so that was really inspiring, especially as a young person within this movement. And also just to be able to talk with and meet Ulla was incredible too, because she's another international delegate from Finland, and she had incredible stories as well. And I was able to share what Peace Action was doing. We were able to talk about what type of actions were really working, what weren't really working when it came to that intergenerational gap I was talking about before. I included this picture here. They even let us try on some kimonos when we were in Nagasaki, and we just had such an amazing time. And everyone was so lovely. I cannot express that enough, how lovely everyone in Japan was. And so the final takeaway I had was just the fact that Kobe is not talked about more, and it should be. I want to start by saying the only thing I knew about Kobe before coming to Japan was the city's beef, Kobe beef. It's quite popular, and I'm a foodie, so I was very excited about that. But what I learned when I came there was that Kobe is a major port city, and it is one of the only port cities in the entire world to have banned the import and export of nuclear weapons. And it did so in 1976. And that whole organizing piece of history has been dubbed the Kobe Formula. And it was incredible to learn about. And thankfully, the organizers there were so gracious, and we got to see the port and see everything that was happening. And I couldn't believe that this city had accomplished what they did with banning nuclear weapons. So that was incredible too, and they were amazing. And I also was able to try Kobe beef while I was there. All this to say, it was such an amazing experience, and I want to take back everything I learned and put it into my work and just have more of that cultural exchange, but especially between Japanese students and American students. So I will stop there because I think I spoke maybe too long.
Definitely not too long, Margaret. Thanks so much for sharing and for sharing your pictures. Congratulations on getting to try Kobe beef. And also, just for your experiences overall, I'm sure you were as well received as I think everyone probably thought you were as lovely as you thought everyone there was. So thanks so much for that, Margaret. As Margaret and Joseph are presenting, if anyone has any questions, please use the Q&A function that should be at the bottom of your screen. If your screen is condensed, you might have to extend it out or hit 3 little dots to see the Q&A. But if you enter your questions there, I'll be filtering through those after Joseph is done speaking, and we'll be asking Margaret and Joseph some questions. So with that, I'll turn it over to Joseph. For those of you who don't know Joseph, he's president of the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security, or CPDCS for short, and co-chair of the Committee for a Sane U.S.-China Policy, and is working with Asia-Pacific partners in developing common security alternatives for the region. And he participated in 2 conferences this summer. He had quite a packed travel itinerary. He was at the 70th anniversary of the Korean Armistice and visited communities impacted by US military bases while in Korea, and then went to Japan for the World Conference Against AH Bombs, where he saw Margaret. So Joseph, I turn it over to you.
Oh, thank you. I'm going to see if I can get my screen share to work here. There we go. There's hope. So first of all, just to appreciate Margaret's really great presentation. It brought back lots of memories, and thanks to riff on. But I'm going to focus here, at least initially, on my time in Korea, and with time permitting, I'll say a little bit more about my time in Japan. I wanted to begin a bit here with some of the context. So while I was in Korea, you had the deepening process and a lot of discussion about what became the August 18th Camp David meeting, where the United States, South Korea, and Japan solidified what's really functionally an alliance, and to understand that this alliance is not something on paper, that the U.S., Japan, and Korea are facing both China and North Korea, and on all sides you have provocative military actions almost every day, which can certainly trigger escalation if something goes wrong. And it's important to understand that in this context that South Korea is maybe the sixth most powerful military in the world, Japan number 10. The South Korean government is really quite unpopular. And in Japan, the Kishida government is operating totally unconstitutionally, moving now to double its military spending and becoming increasingly a global military force. My hosts in South Korea and Seoul were an organization called Peace Momo, and they're really quite a remarkable, largely peace studies kind of organization, but with links to peace forces throughout the country. They are increasingly concerned about the situation on the Korean Peninsula. Their sense is that even as we need to be urging within the peace movements to move beyond the armistice, which basically froze the Korean War in place in 1953, with all the tensions that have followed, and to try to build from that to have a new peace system there. The situation has gotten so tense and so dangerous that they're creating an early warning platform, trying to mobilize people not only in Korea or in Asia, but worldwide, to do what they can to prevent what would be an absolutely catastrophic war. There were basically two themes while I was in South Korea. On the one hand, as Emily has said, it was the 70th anniversary of the armistice, a time for forces around the country to use the occasion to call to moving beyond the armistice to a peace agreement. I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. But at the same time, as you see on the right, a lot of the discussion focused around two triangular confrontations, two semi-alliance systems that are in conflict. On the one hand, in the southern link is the United States, South Korea, and the United States. And there's a weak link in that system, which is principally the Japanese South Korean tensions, which date back, as Mark was saying, to the refusal to deal with the crimes, the oppression, brutality of the Japanese colonial occupation of Japan from 1905 to 1945. And parenthetically, just to say that one of the reasons that Korean Hibakusha got so little support in Korea on their return was that many Koreans believe it was the atomic bombs that basically ended the colonialism, Japanese colonialism in South Korea. In fact, it wasn't the atom bombs, it was Russia joining the war on August the 9th. On the other side, you've got the Chinese, Russian, North Korean alliance system. And North Korea is actually not so much North Korea, but tensions between China and Russia are the weak link there. You note that the new Chinese 10-dash line includes portions of Russia being claimed as Chinese now. These are pictures of our hosts. On the left is Young Moon. She's just now finishing her doctorate in peace studies. Really quite a remarkable and courageous woman. Created Peace Momo out of nothing in a more traditional society where, as she said, people wanted to know what was her lineage in order to be able to do this. What tradition did she come from? And the tradition she came from was absolute peace studies and a range that I'll talk about in a minute. To the right is my good friend Francis Dae-Hoon Lee, and behind him J.J. Suh. They're both scholars. Both were involved in the democracy movement in South Korea, opposing the dictatorship. Francis was tortured by the military government, and I just their analysis of the situation is just really stunning. And I'm working now with Francis on a vision for common security in the Indo-Pacific. He's a great person to work with. In meetings and conferences like that, side conversations can be most revealing. So as some of you will have noted, that the former Chinese minister sort of disappeared for a month, and then he totally disappeared. And there's a lot of question about why. Early on, Francis told me that what he was hearing within Korea was that the foreign minister was involved with espionage, which involved the top levels of the Chinese rocket ministry. And then, as you can see here from the New York Times article, the rocket ministry was totally shaken up. So in terms of the question of espionage, this is certainly a game that's being, not more than a game, it's an existential reality that's being played. This is Kim Hong-gul. He's a member of the South Korean National Assembly or Diet. He was a former senior figure in the previous more liberal government, and he's the Democratic Party government, and he's talked about as a possible future leader of South Korea. He was clear that U.S. policy with Korea is a total failure, in large measure at this point because of lack of carrot and stick approach, lack of carrots, and a continuing kind of hope and belief that North Korea government will collapse. I won't read all this to you here, but simply to say that, I guess, 2 points. One is that increasingly there's the belief, a generational change in South Korea, no longer thinking so much in terms of Korean unification, but that after 70 years and very different political systems and emerging cultures, that we're going to have to deal with two separate governments. The second is that, and this is kind of universally believed there, was the biggest obstacle at this point to negotiating with North Korea is total lack of trust by the North Koreans of the United States. The sense that going into the Hanoi summit with Trump and Bolton, the expectation was from the North and really much of the world that there would be an agreement on a step-by-step process to try to move toward stabilizing relations and moving toward disarmament. But under pressure from Bolton, Trump said no, they had to get rid of all their nuclear weapons immediately, and then we could talk. And with that, the North Koreans really have no trust for the United States. This is Jung. She was at the conference and from the Feminist Institute. And I put this in here because she represented a kind of a broader commitment to nonviolence than we generally see in our peace movement, and it's something that Peace Momo embraces, which is a concern for all marginalized peoples and for animals, and as it says here, non-humans who are exploited and sacrificed by the state. Among the things that she focused on were the use of animals in war. Think in terms of the dogs and the dolphins exploited to pursue state power, sacrificed for that reason. And then talking about the Wagner brigades. This was before Prigozhin's fall, but in terms of just a total sacrifice of, if you will, marginalized people. I mean, convicts in Russian prisons whose lives were essentially worth nothing in this war. This is interesting, at least to me. Kaji Hiromoto, who is from the Japan Peace Studies Association, and his focus, as you can see here, was the need for people both in the United States but among allies to reevaluate Western intolerance for the diversity among political systems. We may not like some of the political systems, may not like what they do, but we certainly can't get rid of them all. and we need to find ways to coexist. He wanted us to understand that we've lived with a kind of a dual world order since the end of the Second World War. On the one hand, the United Nations system and regime, and on the other hand, the efforts of the liberal democracies basically to dominate the world, and pointed to the Chinese, basically saying, and this we don't hear in the United States, that China values the UN system. It's not seeking to overthrow it, but to modify it. And he argued that both the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the Belt and Road systems don't contradict the UN, and that the Chinese legitimacy is based on its respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity, and that with its support, at least tacit support, for the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it's undermining its own legitimacy. We had a meeting in the South Korean parliament. The woman on the left formerly headed the Security Committee. Now she heads the Trade Committee. And to her right is a member who was a four-star general. They're both in the Democratic Party, which is to say in the opposition. I guess just a couple points here to focus on. One was the general saying that we need to take lessons from the 2017 crisis, when the Democratic President Moon basically sent a message to Trump via the Olympics that that war and Trump's threat of fire and fury were really not an option. Underline here, take a look at the concern that Japan is a rising and major military force. This is part of the new world that we live in, and part of the problem. They were anticipating the move to a trilateral alliance. Again, the reference to also Yoon, who is a minority president with very low popular ratings, really seeking to end most relations with China. And the general was saying we need to de-risk, but not to decouple the relations. We went to the DMZ for the a commemoration on the morning of the 70th anniversary. You see nuns on the left. On the right, that's a lot of media there. It included CBS, I think CNN, but my understanding is there was actually no report of this ceremony or of the South Korean, meaningful South Korean commemorations. Here we are at the DMZ. And again, interesting, the conversations you get to have. On the left is a Wang Daneng, who's a Chinese scholar in Hong Kong. Next to her is the former ambassador to the UN from Mongolia I've worked with, and my German partner, Rainer Braun. We can say more about that. And it's been interesting to watch Wang Daneng's evolution. It's been good. This is during the moment of silence. There was a statement which was read. I read part of it, and basically saying that the forever Korean War has got to end. That all negotiating parties must end their hostile policies, and the military exercises, the missile launches from North Korea have to end. And from there, went to another mega conference. You'll see here that Kim Jong-un was there at this conference as well. It was a small conference, only 23 speakers, international and mostly Korean, but also including Christine Ahn from the DMZ, Women Across the DMZ, Kenneth Luce of the National Committee on North Korea here in the United States, and General Leaf, who used to be a senior U.S. general in Korea, all of whom were saying we've got to move toward negotiations. Here's our group picture, and in these sessions you get to have reunions with old friends. Lee Tae-ho is the leader of People's Solidarity for Participatory Democracy, has done great work for more than 20 years. After that, our Peace Momo host took us to 2 U.S. military bases. You should understand we've got something like 38,000 troops in South Korea. It's worth remembering that our own Declaration of Independence says that the British keeping standing armies among us in times of peace necessitated Declaration of Independence and even going to war. The picture you see at the top here is basically the command center for U.S. forces in Northeast Asia, a mere 24 four-star generals there. And as you can see, it's protected by Patriot missiles at the bottom. To build that base, they've seized farmers and other people's property. On the bottom, you see housing on the base taken from a road. And above it, you see the Peace Center there. You know, its decor really communicates part of the message there. Very dedicated and good people. Yeah, this is across from the main gate. Yeah, they had ceremonies there. I don't know if you can quite see it, but in the top banner here, you see a sign that says, "Your sacrifice will never be forgotten." You know, part of the kind of propaganda that they use to reinforce the willingness to sacrifice and the fighting spirit of U.S. Forces. Down below, across from the entrance to the base, is Dr. Yu's Chinese restaurant. In the small print there, what you'll see is that it's American Chinese food. It's not Chinese food, it's American Chinese food. And I couldn't help but be taken by that. What have we got here? Yeah. Yeah, then we went to Camp Casey, which is it's only a quarter the size it was before. I should note that both Camp Humphreys and Camp Casey, their predecessors were in the Seoul area, and they were moved in large measure to get them away from the heavy concentration of Korean people, because you've got crimes, sexual harassment, military accidents, and the idea was to reduce that. So I'm not seeing the slide I want here. Yeah, so this is along the entranceway. You can see keep out, the barbed wire, the fences. Imagine you are a Korean living in that country, in that community, and what that would mean to you. Yeah, the downtown as the base is being reduced in size it looks really depressed. With military bases in the United States, there's got more than 800 of them around the world. You have base what do you call them? Camp towns. With some of the worst of American culture omnipresent there. What you see here on the right is you see the hot pizza and burger there, but above it is a more recent painting, and basically to remember and note what the U.S. military presence has brought with it. The woman is not standing; she is prone, and that communicates a lot of the memory in portions of South Korea. This is more powerful. We were taken to a cemetery of the unnamed. You can see it's totally overgrown. This is where women who were working in the sex industry to serve the U.S. troops, who changed their names because they didn't want to be known who they were, and would send money back to their families. When they died, there would be major kinds of ceremonies, but now the cemetery is totally untended, but it's the scar that lingers there. On the right, and there was actually a picture of this in the New York Times, is a institution now abandoned, where women who were comfort women, basically just as there were Koreans who were enslaved to be comfort women for Japanese forces, so not quite the same slavery, but we had the equivalent of comfort women, and still do, serving U.S. forces in Korea. They were monitored quite regularly for health. and those with sexually transmitted diseases were kept in this building for 2 weeks or so, essentially a prison, while they were medicated so they could go back to serve the troops. How much more time do I have, Emily?
I'm going to give you, let's say, 2 more minutes,
Okay, I'm
Joseph.
going to move real quickly through a few Japan slides. There you see the Peace Museum. One of the things I was struck by and just thrilled by was to see they have a new video exhibit showing actions that people around the world have taken for nuclear weapons abolition. And the picture you see on the right is from a video from the major mobilization we organized in 2010 on the eve of the NPT review conference. We had like 25,000 people there. We had a conference of more than 1,000 at Riverside. And the law of unintended consequences, what we did then is being used now to encourage people to continue taking action. Here, you see, in part, the generational reality of Gensukyo. The picture of Tiro Masakawa, who is one of the leading figures in Gensukyo now. And with him is Setsuko Thurlow, among the most courageous of the Hibakusha. She won was co-recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize for her work with ICANN. And on the right, you see the Argentine ambassador who's going to be chairing the Mexican ambassador who's going to be chairing the NPT review, the TPNW conference in November. This is a place just outside the Peace Park that always breaks my heart. Setsuko is alive today because she didn't go to school on August the 6th, 1945. Her schoolmates were all sent to a place very near what was the epicenter to be clearing firewalls in the midst of what was a firebombing of 60-some Japanese cities. Her classmates, all but a very few, were basically incinerated, not incinerated, vaporized. And she was exposed and going to try to help. During the military occupation, families and others wanted to commemorate these students, were forbidden to do so by the U.S. military occupation, but they wanted to do it, and so their way of doing this was to create this statue, and in a sense in code E equals MC squared, to communicate what happened to these children. Almost there. Yeah, just to give a sense of the size. Yeah, we had intense meetings over the Hiroshima Declaration coming out of the conference. I think one major interesting difference between their movement and ours was really the insistence of calling for the complete withdrawal of Russian forces from Ukraine, in honoring of the UN Charter. They absolutely stress the continuing danger of nuclear weapons, and you can see some of the major points here. Among others, here you see the condemnation of the Kishida government for its reliance on the nuclear deterrent, and the importance, as Margaret pointed out, of disseminating the lessons from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And 2 more. I guess I skipped one slide that I wanted. Simply say, yeah, we do have. Yeah, I've been going to Hiroshima and Nagasaki for 40 years now, dear friends. So this is at a dinner. But the woman on the right here is actually from Vietnam. There's been a long and deep history of relations between the Japanese peace movement and the Vietnamese going back to the war, and it provides an opportunity for building. The picture on the right is of Dejima Island, no longer really quite an island, in Nagasaki, going back to the 1600s. That's where Japan had its opening to the West. And then finally, to say what's the next stop in relationship to the international movement. In November, the week after Thanksgiving here, there's going to be the second meeting of states parties to the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. It's, you can see from the map here, the number of countries that, I guess in green, who have ratified the treaty. I think it's like 69 at the moment, and what 130 some countries have signaled support for it. It's really a formation, really the strongest formation at this point in the world, pressing the nuclear powers to finally fulfill their commitments under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty to engage in nuclear abolition negotiations in good faith. So we'll be organizing there. I know that Emily and Margaret will be deep involved. There'll be conferences and more, and those of you on the call will be certainly getting emails about this in ways that you can join. So thank you very much. I'm sorry I went on just a little bit too long, and hope this was helpful to people in some ways. Let's see if I can start to share here.
Thank you so much, Joseph, for that presentation. You're still sharing your screen, but we are hopefully going to take care of that.
There's the button I want.
There we go. Now I can see everyone again. Thanks, Joseph, for your presentation, and thank you everyone who's been writing their questions, and some of them are just comments or shout outs for Joseph and Margaret for their presentations. If you have questions, feel free to throw them in the chat. We're running a little bit behind on time, so I cannot promise we'll get to all of them, but I'll try to condense them and get to as many as we can. I'm moderating, so I'm going to jump the line and start us off with my own question, which is to you both, Joseph and Margaret. This is the first time I think you're seeing each other's presentations. I think this was your first time meeting each other in Japan, which is funny because you're both based in the US. But was there anything that really struck or surprised you about each other's presentations, or anything you would add? Especially, you know, Margaret, this is your first time going to the World Conference. Joseph, you are like a very well-known kind of staple of the World Conference. How did your experiences kind of differ? How did your presentations, you know, what were your thoughts and takeaways from each other's presentations?
Margaret, you can go first.
Yeah, sure. I actually did meet Joseph at the NPT Review Conference at the UN last year. So that was the first time. This was my second time meeting him. But I would say, like tonight, both of our presentations, I feel like kind of juxtapose each other, where Joseph, you have had many years in this field and you have a lot of wisdom, especially when it comes to concrete policy, and you have, you know, a much grander knowledge of the history than I do. I am still learning things every day, whereas I think in that way I can kind of provide a perspective of someone who's coming into it, so that we know how to promote this awareness and how to reach a wider audience who's not as knowledgeable of the policy and of the history.
Yeah. So I'll just say that you know, I asked Margaret to be speaking in this webinar because I thought her perceptions would be really fresh, and they were. I mean, I've been privileged, and I've worked with the Japanese peace movement now for about 40 years. So I've been to Hiroshima and Nagasaki many times. One of my concerns about myself is I've become a little bit too calloused. You know, the experience of the devastation, nuclear devastation of these cities, and of the hibakusha, you know, it's in my bones, and sometimes you don't pay attention to your bones. But yeah, I think one thing to highlight from Margaret's talk, which I fully agree with, was the focus of of Gensukyo on generational transition, on the focus it gives to developing young, basically developing consciousness about Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the need to abolish nuclear weapons among the rising generations. The reality is we couldn't afford it, but we couldn't afford not to. And so my grandson came with us to Hiroshima, and he participated in a youth workshop. A youth workshop. There was about 300 people, in which Margaret was also speaking. And you know, just to say the on the one hand, the lessons, the seminar by Tanaka Terumi, who's the former head of the major network organization confederation of A-bomb survivors, but it's just a great lesson for everybody there. And then just the spirit of the young people there and being able to be a part of that. And I know that Gensukyo is prioritizing sending young people to come to New York for the TPNW second meeting. The more we can get young people there to engage with them, to pick up their spirit, the better.
Great. Thank you both so much for that. I'll jump into some of the questions we've gotten. This first one I think is really more specifically to Margaret, but Sally Jones has asked, what could collaborations between student organizers in Japan and the US look like?
Yeah, that's something I've been thinking about since I got back. And I think I could see a lot of different things happening. If there are students coming to New York during the second meeting, we could have some type of public demonstration outside of the UN, but also just, I think the opportunity for students to meet and maybe even compare what their education was like and what it was like to learn about the atomic bombings, and maybe draw some similarities, draw some differences, and then maybe they can turn to, okay, what does our nuclear policy look like in our countries, draw similarities and differences, and work from there. And I'd be curious to hear what Japanese students have to say and what ideas they have for actions too. So I think the most important thing we need to do is make sure that they are in a room together, that they can talk about this and exchange those ideas.
Great. Thanks, Margaret. And yes, we're actually currently emailing back and forth trying to make plans for late November and December during the second meeting of state parties to be able to have a youth exchange like that. So that's great. The next question I'm going to ask is specifically, I think, more directed towards Joseph, but I might chime in depending on what he says. Jeffrey Barkdale is asking, is there a way for both North and South Korea to permanently end the Korean War and make progress towards peace and reunification before it's too late?
Well, there certainly is. I mean, we're talking about humans, and humans make the decisions about what happens. I think the United States needs to take the next steps, which is very hard for people in Washington to understand. We're always the good guys, right? And we don't really project ourselves into the experiences of others. One doesn't have to love what I believe is a very repressive North Korean government to recognize the need for common security. The North Korean experience is that during the Korean War, the United States destroyed something like 90% of all buildings in North Korea. The devastation to the North Korean population was massive. And since then, the United States, on the one hand, during crisis, has prepared and threatened to initiate nuclear war against North Korea about 12 times. And the United States, and in joint military exercises with South Korea and Japan, major exercises, regularly practices and threatens the ability to totally destroy, to take out the North Korean leadership and potentially to destroy the country. And on top of that, as I said before, with the Hanoi summit, the idea of any possible trust between North Korea and the United States was shattered. I mean, I have no love for the Kim regime; it's a Kim dynasty, but that's who's there, and they want to continue ruling. The next steps have to look like a reduction of the military exercises. It needs to look to reducing some of the sanctions. And with some of those steps in place, you can begin imagining the possibility of some negotiations, perhaps mediated, I hate to say it, by China and even Japan. It's interesting interesting difference between South Korea and Japan is that Kishida is willing to go to North Korea in order to meet Kim to at least negotiate the return or to learn about the status of some of the Japanese nationals who were kidnapped by North Korea and taken to serve the regime. So it's the need to talk, is go back to Winston Churchill, jaw, jaw, jaw instead of war, war, war.
Great. Thank you, Joseph, for that answer. I'll also just say, and I think maybe some of the questions/comments mentioned it, while you were in Korea, there was a mobilization here in the US in DC for the 70th anniversary of the armistice, and both Women Cross DMZ and the Korea Peace Now Network are doing great work if you happen to be in the US. There's the Peace on the Korean Peninsula Act that they've been working on. It's HR 1369, which is a congressional resolution that seeks to have a formal end to the Korean War, as you were saying. So if you are US based and interested in getting involved, these are two organizations that do great work, and Peace Action New York State is part of the Korea Peace Now grassroots network. Sorry, really need to make that plug, but I really appreciate your much more in-depth answer, Joseph. The next question I'm going to ask is from it's kind of a compilation of some different things that we've been getting, but I'll kind of ask it to both of you. Joseph, you ended your talk talking about the second meeting of state parties. How have kind of your experiences in both Korea and Japan influenced your upcoming work and ideas around the second meeting of state parties? What have you learned in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, about how we can stop and deter nuclear threats and attacks and facilitate cooperation for nuclear disarmament? That's me rolling a bunch of questions into one, but both, I think, the second meetings of state parties, if you want to talk about that, and just generally, what have you learned about the nuclear disarmament movement through these in-person global exchanges that might strengthen or influence your work going forward?
Margaret, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So like I said before, the average age of hibakusha is 85 this year. And I think as I said, as was a big takeaway of going to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, is that we need to bring these stories into the narrative as much as possible when we're talking about nuclear policy in the US, because people need to hear more about nuclear policy as much as they've seen Oppenheimer this year. They need to be hearing these stories of the hibakusha now more than ever, because the generation of hibakusha is getting so much older and they won't be able to tell their stories firsthand. And so I think that should be talked about at this meeting. The first time I heard a hibakusha speak was at the NPT review conference at the UN last year too. So I think it's really important to just keep that energy going and keep those stories. Yeah, I hope that answers the question, but that's the main thing I was thinking of.
Good. So let me just kind of build on that. One of the things that was missing from the Oppenheimer film was any images of what Hiroshima and Nagasaki looked like after the A bombings, or the voices of those who survived. And so I think with the Japanese delegation coming, it provides an opportunity to kind of bring the human dimension into our understanding. A couple other things. I mean, from my experiences there, on the one hand, you think in terms of the international dimensions, and so within the government realities, we know that we may have some new signers, some new ratifications for the treaty. But here in the United States, one of the things that's very important for people to do, Physicians for Social Responsibility has taken the lead in legislation. I believe it's HR 69. We'll send it out to people after this webinar, basically urging the United States to send an observer delegation. Even if the United States doesn't sign the treaty, it should be there to listen, to learn, and maybe begin to build the forces within our government who may in time not only reduce opposition to it, but maybe even in time to sign. So we have a responsibility and a potential here to try to influence our government policy. I guess the other thing to say is just the international dimension. I remember seeing in one of Margaret's pictures, I think from Kobe, my friend Oleg Bodrov there. You know, we had the opportunity to engage with Russians, with you know, the Germans will be coming, British will be coming to the TPNW. So it's an opportunity for us to experience and build the international movement. How to deter? I mean, I think one thing, two things I would say here. Additionally, you know, listening to Margaret's initial presentation, you know, the reality is I'm a whole lot older. A big surprise, and that's given me time to learn a lot of history and to learn a lot of things. I'm you know, Kurt Vonnegut, one of my favorite writers, as well as Howard Zinn, wrote that if you don't know your history, you can't be free. And so I think it's really incumbent on us to encourage as many people as we can, especially the rising generation, you know, to learn the history that's not being taught in Florida, and to build from that. And see if I can remember my second thought there. I think this other thought is going to pass right now. It'll pass.
Let me know if it comes back, Joseph. I know we're at 8, which is originally when we thought we would end, but we've got so many questions. I'm hoping maybe folks can hang on for just another 5 to 10 minutes while we get to more. Seeing a thumbs up from Joseph. I'm seeing a nod from Margaret. So we will carry on and try not to keep anyone too late, but there's just some great questions in here. The next one raised by Sylvia Rodriguez Case and Diana Stewart. Obviously, you know, you're in Japan and Korea at this time where the Japanese government has just started dumping the radioactive water from Fukushima. Was this a topic of conversation during the conference formally? Were you having informal conversations? As you were walking around, what were you hearing and seeing about the Fukushima dumping from folks in Japan and perhaps also in Korea?
I'll jump in here and say one of the pictures that I had wanted to include but didn't have the time to do it was a photograph of the delegation of young people from Fukushima, who were talking about how they've been left behind and the dangers that they face. Gensukyo has been really quite clear in criticizing the Japanese government for its release of the still contaminated water. I think we need to get past the propaganda that it's totally pure. It's not. And of course, in Korea and in China, there's essentially outrage that this is being dumped, that this will affect their food supply, and it will be one more source of tension, of weakening the Japanese South Korean alliance, especially with Yoon having blessed the release.
Great, thanks. Margaret, do you have anything you would like to add to that?
No, other than that, there definitely was that conversation happening at the conference. And yeah, as Joseph said, there were a lot of young people, especially, who were talking about that issue and bringing it on stage. And so I'm glad that we were talking about it because it was a big topic of discussion.
Great. Thanks, Margaret. I'll also just quickly add, I know here in New York City, while you were both in Japan, there was a rally for the August 6th and 9th commemorations outside of the Japanese consulate. And part of the open letter, in addition to apologizing on behalf of the US for the bombings, was also urging the Japanese government not to dump this water. So that was a part of our demonstrations here as well. And I actually think there's demonstrations being planned outside of the Japanese consulate this upcoming week as part of Climate Week by Korean groups that will be here to oppose that dumping as well. So certainly a big topic of conversation. And I just love that there's so many things happening all at once globally. It made me really feel connected, even though I was here in the US while you all were over there. A couple other questions, this one specifically for Margaret from William Root. Did you learn anything, I'm going to say either before your trip or during your trip, about whether Japan would have surrendered before the US dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Is this something that you learned growing up? Is this something that was addressed in the conference?
Yes, it is absolutely not something I learned growing up. I would say in my education, we learned that the bombing was the end of World War II, and without it, World War II would have continued. And of course, I learned that that wasn't exactly the case, and it was the entrance of the Soviet Union into the war that led to Japan's surrender. And I think that that needs to be talked about more, especially among students.
If I could just add, because I've actually written about this in a couple of books, simply to say that Truman's Secretary of War, Stimson, had told him that Japan's surrender could be arranged on terms acceptable to the United States without having to use the atomic bomb. Eisenhower opposed it. Admiral Leahy opposed it. Japan was functionally defeated. And as Leahy said, and the expectation was, even as they were doing the carpet bombing of the cities, was Japan would have to surrender by November with a blockade. It absolutely wasn't necessary. And the decision to drop the bomb was largely driven by the need to bring the war to an immediate end in order not to have to share influence with the Soviets in northern China, Manchuria, and Korea, ambitions that didn't come to be fulfilled. And it was, as we said before, the Russian entry into the war on August 9th that led Hirohito to order his cabinet to surrender.
Great. Thank you both for those responses. I'm going to kind of combine the next two questions for you, Joseph. One from Amiko Hirano, who's part of Shinfujin, the New Japan Women's Association. Hi, Emmy. And the other one from Jackie Cabasso. One from Emmy is, have you heard anything about general feelings in Korea about the reinforcement of the Japan-Korea-US military alliance? What are feelings like around that? And the second one from Jackie is about whether you participated in a planning meeting in Seoul about possibly an international tribunal to demand justice for Korean Hibakusha. If that happened, how's it going?
So two good questions. First of all, within certainly the peace movement in South Korea, the opposition to this alliance is deep and universal, and a perception that it's driving toward the possibility of war, which is in part why Peace Momo was putting out its early warning and urging people to mobilize. Kurt Campbell, who's the figure in the National Security Council who really drove this, has been saying, well, this is a permanent alliance. It's been done to put it in place for a very long term. With Yoon's lack of popularity, in a sense, he's trying to rule like Trump with a minority, with a disciplined minority. The sense is that this alliance may not last all that long, and I think we certainly have to call it into question as rather than pursuing diplomacy, building and preparing for war. In terms of the Sparks effort to organize an international tribunal to focus on the suffering and experience of the Korean Hibakusha, there's not universal agreement on how that's going to go forward. I think it's best to say that they're in an exploratory mode. As I understand it, they want to focus really almost exclusively on international law, and their hope is to be able to bring a legal case within the U.S. Judicial system. My sense is if it goes forward, it will be a somewhat narrow event. I've encouraged them to link to the really increased danger that we face now. I think we need to understand this is not the old world of the Cold War or the post-Cold War system. We are in an increasingly dangerous situation with great power confrontation, and arms races, and threats. We're in a very destabilized and dangerous situation. And my hope has been that they would be willing, and I know Gensukyo's talked with them about this as well. My hope has been that they would broaden out their focus to build more support. But if they want to go with something narrow, that's fine. the idea that they're going to be able to do something within the U.S. judicial system, I say, I would love for that to happen. The Japanese have tried it, but I don't think it's going to work.
Great. Thanks, Joseph, for those responses. We're now 10 minutes over, so I think I'm going to give you both one more question to wrap it up. And it's, sorry, once again, my own, there's many questions we did not get to, but I like to end us on kind of a positive note. Obviously, you've both talked about and alluded to the fact that this is a very tense time. Nuclear tensions are, the highest that they've certainly ever been in my lifetime, and I assume Margaret's as well. And it can often feel like there's a lot that we're up against. While you were traveling, was there anything that you experienced or saw, or an interaction that really kind of gave you hope or something to look forward to or feel good about in this current moment?
Margaret?
Wow. I mean, I thought the whole conference was full of good feelings. I mean, let me expand on that. As I said, it was my introduction into Japanese spaces and being in Japan for the first time. And the way that I was met with so much warmth, no one was, ignoring me, or no one was like berating me for getting something wrong or not knowing all the history, not knowing all Japanese policy. It was just constantly being in solidarity with them and getting to hear their stories and what they do, and then me getting to talk about what peace action does. And being in that space was incredible. And I think just having a space of tolerance and solidarity and more cross-cultural communication like that is what is going to bring more change. And so there is so much room for anger and bitterness and rage against our political systems and institutions, but at the same time, like, having that love there and tolerance is so important too. And I think I was really reminded of that being in Japan.
So I'll begin with Korea. One of the things that I've observed over time is that people coming out of oppression who've been involved in struggles for democracy and freedom, on the other side, sometimes bear the, if you will, the pure spirit of commitments to human dignity and to democracy and to peace. So what I see, what I continue to see in Korea are people who played major roles in the democracy struggle in Korea, who are continuing work in that tradition, and whose vision is just very, very clear. And related to that, just as I tried to show with the Peace Momo slides, the ability there to be really working cross-generationally. So you see Moon, for example, and the kind of leadership she's providing, and I guess I would add to that just the courage and the steadfastness of the peace groups in those communities where the military bases are, and their resistance and their struggle really to win recognition of their own dignity and rights. And would that I could just kind of carry it and have it as a have it as a something material that we could all imbibe. I wish for that. And in terms of Japan, I think I've known Gensuke now for a very long time. I know how hard COVID was on its organization, its inability to hold in-person meetings, and so the ability to hold 2 conferences with a total of more than 5,000 people in person, plus online, is a reflection of the commitment and the revitalization of the Japanese movement. And the reality is that the Hibakusha and the Japanese movement play an absolutely central role, if you will, of kind of the foundation, not only the legitimacy but also the spirit of the nuclear abolition movement. And so to see that flame still burning, and if you will, getting brighter after COVID, was wonderful to see.
Great. Well, thank you both so much for sharing your experiences. Thank you everyone that tuned in tonight. I think at our height we had, somewhere around 120 or 130 people. And from various parts of the world and time zones, from what I can tell from a glance. So I really appreciate everyone joining us tonight. And thank you both again. And I hope everyone has a great evening and stay tuned. If you're not already in the New York City area, we hope you'll consider coming here for the second meeting of state parties. It starts November 27th, so right after Thanksgiving here in the US. And yeah, here's to looking forward to whatever's next. Great.
Thanks so much, Emily. And
thanks, everyone.
And thank you so much,
Thank
Joseph.
you. Thank
Thanks,
you. A
everyone.
delight to be working with you, Margaret.
You too.
Honored to know and work with both of you.